pretty serious clashes between Iran and the Taliban forces in Afghanistan. Afghanistan under the Taliban will become one of the greatest epicenters for spreading insecurity in the region. And I think those reports have some substance in them. There is something called the Jihadi High. There is this intoxication of jihad, of many of the Taliban fighters being bored with the kind of administrative or police duties that they've been given. That is not their mindset. Now, the Indian policy is somewhat confused, I would say. It's quite ambiguous for now. Last week, there were some pretty serious clashes between Iran and the Taliban forces in Afghanistan. This was around, the main issue was of course river waters, but the kind of clashes we saw coming into between the Iranians and the Afghans or the Taliban were pretty serious. In fact, some of these clashes brought back memories of the 90s when the Taliban had massacred Iranian diplomats, and it seemed that Iran and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan might actually go into a war. But in this particular case, a lot of heavy weaponry was used. The Taliban fighters were making videos in which they were openly proclaiming that they will occupy parts of Iran. And they were pretty belligerent. From the Iranian side, of course, there was retaliation, but we didn't hear the kind of blood-curdling threats that were being issued from the Afghan side, the Taliban side really. But this was just one episode of what has been happening in Afghanistan and between Afghanistan and its neighbors. We've seen serious problems emerge between the Taliban regime and the Pakistanis. Again, on the face of it, both sides seem to be trying to tackle things politically. There is diplomatic engagement, and yet the nub of the problem, which is security, hasn't really been addressed by the Taliban. So Pakistan, of course, is in a bit of a soup. The same thing is happening to an extent with the Central Asian states. Now, there are very serious concerns, at least in Tajikistan and to some extent in Uzbekistan, over how the Taliban are going to address the security issues. The Uzbeks have also had some tensions over river waters with the Taliban, but on the security issue, there are outstanding issues between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan and between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And the reason for these security concerns is that many of the insurgent terror groups, jihadist groups, which have their firing, which have the Uzbeks and the Tajiks in their crosshairs, are actually based in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban regime has been giving a lot of assurances. Publicly, they have taken a position that they are trying to restrain many of these groups. Some of these groups have actually been absorbed in the Taliban forces. From whatever is being said publicly, the fact of the matter is that on the ground, there are reports of training camps for many of the jihadists from Central Asia. There are training camps for some Pakistani groups as well. And of course, we know that with Iran, it's a pretty testy relationship which exists right now. All of this is leading to serious questions about whether Afghanistan under the Taliban will become one of the greatest epicenters for spreading insecurity in the region. And I think those reports have some substance in them, because the Taliban, for all the niceties that they are propounding in public, in their direct engagement, they don't seem to be doing anything to actually clamp down on these groups. They are supposed to be restraining these groups. They are saying that we are trying to make sure that no attack takes place from our soil. But for example, in the case of Pakistan, we know that many of the TTP guys come from Afghanistan, attack and then go back. The Taliban, however, insist that the TTP has no presence in Afghanistan, which of course nobody takes seriously. Now, there is a problem for the Taliban as well. The big problem for the Taliban is, which is a problem which many other armies or these kind of groups have faced in the past. How do you demobilize the warriors? And I think this is a problem which the Taliban are increasingly going to face, especially because there is something called the Jihadi High. There is this intoxication of jihad, which affects a lot of people, and there are again there are videos, there are reports of many of the Taliban fighters being bored with the kind of administrative or police duties that they have been given. That is not their mindset, and there is no training program for demobilizing them and then training them to become either civil servants or become police officers or do anything else in normal society. And for them, the sheer boredom of what is some people have called the corporate life is just not for them. It makes them uneasy, it makes them restless, and it does not give them the high which the kind of jihadist fights they were getting into would give to them. So, this is increasingly going to become a major problem going forward. Afghanistan under the Taliban, the Islamic Emirate as it is called, it is not a normal modern nation state. It is a pretty medieval kind of a state. Now, there have been some reports that economically the Taliban are able to manage. They are able to generate revenues from partly from smuggling, partly from foreign trade. Nobody is very clear on how they are making payments for whatever they are importing, because there is not much to export from Afghanistan except drugs. So, how are those payments working? What are the informal channels being used? There is a lot of opacity in all of that information. But at least there have been a couple of reports from the World Bank and others which say that the economy seems to have stabilized. But frankly, I think if you look a little deeper, the economy of Afghanistan has stabilized not in the way we understand economy stabilizing. Afghanistan under the Taliban is not a welfare state, far from it. It is not a normal nation state which will cater to which will build hospitals, which will build schools, which will do all the discharge all the functions which a normal state does. It's not a state in that sense, and most of the revenues are basically used to run the government and to fund the army. So, it is in a sense a militaristic medieval state with no real plans on how to keep pace with the modern world. It's also a state which has virtually been cut off from the rest of the world. There is no country which has formally recognized the Taliban regime even now, although there are many countries which have opened up their embassies, which have allowed the Taliban to open their embassies, but they haven't really recognized the Taliban regime. Now, part of the problem is going to be going forward that while this is a regime which is able to collect taxes, which is able to, which has consolidated its control in the country, this is not a regime which is ready to move in step with the rest of the world, even on certain basic norms. And they are not interested, for example, in any of the suggestions that have been made to them from international groups or from other countries, which have asked them to moderate their position, for example, on women education, children, welfare activities, human rights, the rights of refugees. On none of those issues, the Taliban have given in to whatever requests or whatever suggestions or advice have been given to them. They are sticking to their own particular worldview, and frankly, they are showing a middle finger to the rest of the world. And the fact of the matter remains that while the Taliban are uncompromising on their own norms, the rest of the world seems to be compromising on their norms. And this is something which is the Taliban seem to be confident that this is something that they can play around with. This is something that they can sit it out using that old dictum of theirs that while the people in the rest of the world might have the watches, the Taliban have the time. And because there is no real military challenge to their rule, nobody is ready to support the dissident elements in Afghanistan. The Taliban are sitting pretty. They have some challenges coming their way from the ISIS or the ISKP, and maybe some of the more disgruntled elements between all these terror groups which have taken refuge in Afghanistan and have made Afghanistan a safe haven. And because of their presence, Afghanistan, even if it might not be directly involved in many other parts of the world in terms of active terrorism, it is becoming a kind of an epicenter for the global propaganda machinery of the jihadists, especially the Al-Qaeda, for example, but even the ISKP has its a very fairly advanced, I would say, propaganda machinery which is operating from Afghan soil. And of course, some of it is spilling over into other parts of the region, but Afghanistan remains the epicenter of what is happening. And these safe havens are actually causing a lot of concern. A lot of the engagement which is taking place where countries like Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran and even India and some other Central Asian countries which have opened up their missions in Kabul, they are doing this because they want to keep some kind of an engagement going with the Taliban. Unlike the 1990s in Taliban 1.0, when it was only 3 countries and then only 1 country which was maintaining a diplomatic presence in Afghanistan. This time there are international organizations and foreign countries which have opened up their missions in Afghanistan. Now, a lot of this engagement is taking place under the cover of humanitarian activity, that nobody wants to abandon the Afghan people, and that if you have to give humanitarian assistance to the Afghans, then it is best to have a presence out there so that you can coordinate and monitor the activities, the welfare activities that are happening. But frankly, I think this is a very flimsy kind of a cover for the more important job of wanting to have a kind of a listening post in Kabul, wanting to have some lines of communication open to the Taliban, so that when required, you could press those buttons and try and get whatever you want from these guys. For a country like India, which has also opened up its mission in Kabul, we have a vital interest. It's a vital security interest which we have in Afghanistan. Now, the Indian policy is somewhat confused, I would say. It's quite ambiguous for now. We are keeping an engagement with the Taliban, and that engagement is understandable. We don't want to be completely left blindsided by what is happening inside Afghanistan. And we need to have some kind of a line of communication with the people in Afghanistan. But at the same time, I think there are some very troublesome aspects of the Indian policy. And these problematic aspects of the Indian policy are not something really new. It's a kind of a conventional wisdom in the Indian foreign policy establishment, or at least that's what I feel, that if you are engaged with one person or one particular party in a country, then it is best to sever your connections with the others, lest that one party that you are engaged with feels feels offended that you are also engaging with people who are opposed to that party. Now, I personally think that for a country like India to remain engaged with the Taliban makes sense, but to then sever your connections with all the other Afghans who were such good friends of ours, and we stuck by them not just for the last 20 years, but even during those Taliban years, to simply turn your back on those people. For example, we are not renewing many of the visas for the students. We've not done anything to provide relief and rescue efforts, or to try and take out some of the people from Afghanistan who might be in danger in Afghanistan, bring them into India. None of them were going to settle in India anyways. They didn't intend to. They were just going to use India as a kind of a stepping boat to go somewhere else, probably to the Western countries. But I think this is something which we have done, which we should have rescued our friends, and not having done that is going to rankle among many of those people. And we should remember that there's never any full stop as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Whatever is happening today will not be the same 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There will be people who will come back to Afghanistan, and many of them will not have very good memories of how India turned her back on them at a time when they really needed India's support. I would have thought that it would make more sense for India that even when we are engaging the Taliban, we can use that as a kind of a leverage to try and pull out and provide some relief and rescue to our older friends in Afghanistan. In fact, we tend to have a greater influence if we are engaged with everybody in Afghanistan rather than only one particular player in the Afghan system. Of course, now I don't mean that we should be engaged with the ISKP. We should explore if we can bring some influence into play to try and moderate the Taliban, for example. It seems that Afghanistan is likely to emerge as the biggest destabilizing factor in this region in the years ahead. And by staying on in Kabul, even if it's a very limited presence, I think not just India but many of the other countries are trying to keep their options open, keep their ear to the ground, and try and see how they can navigate through what might be coming their way in the future. That is where matters stand right now. It's not a very happy situation in Afghanistan, and it's certainly a very concerning situation as far as the security dimension is concerned, especially since the Taliban is refusing to sever its connection with international terror organizations like the Al-Qaeda or its subcontinental arm, the AQIS. It is taking on the ISKP, but that's an internal power struggle, and that is understandable. They would take on the ISKP. But what is of concern is their refusal to act against groups like the TIP, groups like the IMU, groups like the Ansarullah or the Tajik Taliban,
who are operating inside Tajikistan, other groups, Sunni extremist groups which are active against Iran, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is quite active against Pakistan, and there are reports of groups like the Jaish-e-Mohammed and some of the other Kashmiri groups which are once again making a play in Afghanistan. So I think it is important that the Taliban, if they actually want to be rehabilitated in the Committee of Nations, to actually crack down on these guys. But I think the Taliban calculation is that even if they don't do any such thing, the world will come to them because the world has no choice. And that is the greatest tragedy of Afghanistan.